Parker always looked forward to the quiet weekends at his lake cabin. Tucked between tall pines and a stretch of calm water, the small wooden home felt like another world compared to the constant rush of the city. It wasn't just a place to relax, it was family history. His grandfather had built the cabin decades ago with his own hands and had grown up learning to fish off the dock, split firewood for the stove, and listen to the gentle sounds of loons calling across the water at night. Every corner of the cabin held a memory, and that made it priceless. The surrounding community was part of a private development managed by a homeowners association. The HOA kept the shared roads paved, trimmed common lawns, and enforced certain rules about property maintenance. It had a reputation for being overly strict, but kept to himself and rarely dealt with them. His taxes and dues were always paid on time, and he followed the guidelines as best he could. He had no reason to expect trouble. One Friday evening, as arrived at the cabin with groceries in hand, he noticed a letter taped to his front door. At first he thought it was some kind of neighborhood update, but when he opened it, his eyebrows furrowed. The letter stated that his account with the HOA was seriously delinquent. It claimed he owed several years' worth of unpaid fees and warned that legal action might follow if he failed to pay. Sat on the porch swing with the letter in his hands, reading it twice more. It didn't make sense. He always paid by bank draft, and the payments cleared every month. He even remembered saving the receipts. Confused but calm, he placed the letter on the coffee table inside and decided to check his bank records later that night. The following morning after coffee, he logged into his account and pulled up the statements. There they were, 12 payments a year, each with the HOA's name clearly listed. He felt reassured but also unsettled. How could they claim he hadn't paid when the evidence was right there? He printed copies of the statements, slipped them into a folder, and decided to pay the HOA office a visit the next week. On Monday afternoon, stopped by the association's office. It was a low brick building near the entrance of the community. Inside, he was greeted by a polite receptionist who asked him to wait. After a few minutes, the HOA president stepped into the lobby. She was tall, poised, and carried herself with an air of authority that bordered on dismissive. "Yes, Mr. Parker," said, folding her arms. "What seems to be the issue?" Handed her the letter and calmly explained. "I received this notice, but I've paid every fee on time. Here are the records from my bank." Barely glanced at the folder before shaking her head. "Our system shows otherwise. You have a significant balance outstanding, and it needs to be resolved." "With respect," said, his voice even but firm, "your system is wrong. These statements prove I've paid." Gave a thin smile. "If you believe that, you're welcome to contest it in writing, but as of now, the balance stands. If it isn't addressed soon, the association will take appropriate action." Left the office unsettled. Her tone was cold, almost as if she wanted him to give up rather than pursue the matter. That evening, he called a neighbor, an older man named Richard who had lived at the lake for years. Richard sighed when he heard the story. "You're not the first," Richard said. "They've sent notices like that to others. Most folks just pay to make it go away, even when they know they don't owe a dime." Frowned, "And if you fight it?" Richard hesitated before replying. "Nobody ever wins, at least not around here." The conversation left uneasy, but he wasn't the type to fold under pressure. He tucked his documents back into the folder and placed it in his desk drawer at the cabin. If the HOA wanted to push him, they'd find he wasn't easily pushed. For now, though, he tried to let it go, focusing instead on the crisp evening air and the sound of the lake lapping against the shore. Still, as he watched the sun dip behind the trees, couldn't shake the thought that the letter was only the beginning of something much bigger. The following week, tried to resume his normal routine at the cabin, but an uneasy feeling lingered. Every creak of the floorboards and rustle of the trees seemed louder now, as if the forest itself was aware of the tension building around him. He spent mornings fishing by the dock and evenings writing in his journal, but the letter from the HOA weighed heavily on his mind. Paying a phantom fee was unthinkable. His family's legacy deserved better. On a Thursday afternoon, another envelope appeared on the doorstep. This one was thicker and the tone inside was sharper. It claimed additional fines had been added to his balance for late fees and administrative costs. There was a warning that, if unpaid, the HOA would escalate the matter to legal proceedings. Stomach sank. He opened his bank app and double-checked his statements once more. Everything still matched perfectly. He decided it was time to confront the situation head-on. Scheduled another meeting with, hoping a face-to-face conversation might clear the air. He drove along the winding lake roads, the late afternoon sunlight glinting off the water, and tried to calm himself. He had always been patient, but the relentless notices from the HOA were testing his limits. The office was empty when he arrived, save for, she looked up from her desk with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Back again, Mr. Parker?" she said, her tone polite but distant. "I'm here to resolve this once and for all," said. "I've provided evidence that all my fees are paid. Can we go over it together?" Leaned back in her chair, studying him for a moment. "Our records show you're behind, and until that balance is cleared, there's nothing more to discuss. You can submit an appeal in writing if you wish, but it won't prevent enforcement actions." His jaw tightened. "Enforcement actions? What does that mean exactly?" His eyes flicked to a folder on her desk. "It means the association may take steps to ensure compliance. That's all I can say at this time." The words felt like a threat and left the office with a heavy heart. On his drive back to the cabin, he couldn't shake the image of his grandfather, who had built the cabin from scratch with nothing but determination and sweat. It was hard to imagine anyone having the audacity to challenge what rightfully belonged to him. Over the next few days, the notices kept arriving. Emails, letters, even phone calls from the HOA's office. Each one grew more insistent, hinting that legal action was imminent. Felt a knot tighten in his chest. He decided to consult with a lawyer, someone who could review his documents and explain what the HOA was legally allowed to do. The lawyer listened carefully as recounted the situation. "From what you've described," the attorney said, "the HOA doesn't have the right to threaten property seizure without proper legal procedure. What they're doing could be considered overreach." Felt a flicker of hope. "So I can fight this?" "Yes," the lawyer said, "but be prepared. HOAs can be stubborn, and they often rely on fear to push residents into paying. You'll need thorough documentation and patience." Returned to the cabin that evening with renewed determination. He spread his bank statements across the kitchen table and created a folder for all correspondence with the HOA. Photos of the cabin, copies of letters, and screenshots of emails were carefully organized. For the first time in days, he felt in control. Even as he worked, a sense of foreboding lingered. Neighbors whispered quietly about the HOA's power. Some had seen properties taken or altered without apparent justification, but none had resisted. His friend Richard had called again, his voice cautious. "You really think you can take them on?" Richard asked. "I have to," replied firmly. "I can't just let them rewrite history. This cabin is my family's legacy, and I won't back down." Richard sighed. "Just be careful they don't play fair." Knew Richard was right, but there was no turning back. He spent the evening checking his emails, documenting everything, and mentally preparing for the next confrontation. Outside, the lake reflected the sunset in fiery streaks of orange and gold. For it was a reminder that even in the face of threats, there was beauty and peace worth protecting. Little did he know, the real test of his resolve was just beginning. The letters and threats were only a prelude to something far more alarming, something that would challenge every ounce of his patience, courage, and connection to family. The quiet peace of the lake was about to be shattered. Had returned to the cabin that Friday evening, hoping that another quiet weekend would allow him to regroup. The lake glimmered under the fading sunlight, and the air was filled with the familiar smell of pine and fresh water. He parked his truck and stepped onto the gravel driveway, humming softly to himself. But the hum caught in his throat the moment he saw the scene ahead. The cabin, his grandfather's legacy, was surrounded by heavy machinery. A bulldozer idled ominously near the front, while a small crew of workers moved with an efficiency that made his chest tighten. Shards of wood and scattered personal belongings littered the yard. His heart pounded. "What is happening?" he whispered to himself, rushing forward. A foreman noticed him and stepped aside, blocking the path to the cabin. "Sir, you can't go in right now. "We're authorized to start demolition today," he said, his tone polite but firm. His eyes widened in disbelief. "Authorized? Authorized by who? I have all my payments. This is my property." The foreman shrugged. "I'm just doing my job. The order came from the HOA. You'll need to discuss it with them." His hands trembled as he reached for his phone. He dialed office, hoping she would intervene, explain a mistake, or stop the destruction. The call went unanswered. Another attempt reached only voicemail. Panic began to creep in, followed by a cold, sinking anger. By the time he ran to the edge of the porch, the workers had already torn off a section of the cabin's front wall. The scent of sawdust mixed with the crisp lake air, but barely noticed. His grandfather's rocking chair lay splintered, the wood cracked and twisted. Memories flooded him, lazy summer mornings with coffee in hand, evenings watching the sun set over the water, family laughter echoing through the rooms, all of it being destroyed before his eyes. His first instinct was to intervene physically, but the foreman stepped forward. "Sir, you're trespassing. Please stay back, or I'll have to call the authorities." He wanted to argue, to demand justice, but the situation felt surreal. The legal threats from letters now had a horrifying, tangible reality. The cabin wasn't just a structure anymore. It was his heritage, his personal history being erased. Finally, he gave a sharp exhale and backed away, his mind racing. "There has to be some way to stop this," he muttered. He ran back to his truck, grabbed his laptop, and tried calling every lawyer and official he could think of. Local authorities, when reached, claimed that the HOA was acting within their purported rights and would not intervene. It seemed as though every institution had turned a blind eye. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. Documented everything: photos of the destruction, timestamps, notes about the workers and their equipment. He recorded the remains of his furniture and personal belongings, knowing he would need evidence for any legal action. But even as he took photos, a deep sense of helplessness settled in. How could a small, overreaching board destroy property without consequences? When the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the lake, finally sat on the remaining porch steps, staring at what was left of the cabin. The water reflected the sky's fiery reds and oranges, and for a moment he drew a breath, trying to calm the anger and disbelief. He realized he couldn't face this alone. The situation had gone beyond mere dispute over fees. This was deliberate, reckless, and personal. He needed help, someone with knowledge of the law, someone who could cut through the red tape and expose the HOA's actions. As he sat there in the gathering twilight, he remembered a conversation from years earlier with his cousin Rachel, a respected attorney at the Department of Justice. Rachel had always stood firmly for justice and fairness, never afraid to take on powerful institutions. Reached for his phone, dialed her number, and held it to his ear as it rang. His voice, usually calm and measured, shook slightly as he spoke. "Rachel, something happening with the cabin. They've started tearing it down. I don't know what to do." There was a pause on the other end, and then Rachel's voice came, steady and sharp. "Stay calm. Don't confront them. Take photos, document everything. I'll handle the rest. This is illegal and you have the right to fight it. We'll get it stopped." Hearing her words, a spark of hope ignited amidst the devastation. Though much of the cabin had been lost, realized he now had an ally with the authority and expertise to confront the HOA. He could feel a plan beginning to take shape in his mind, a path forward where justice might prevail. That night, as the lake reflected the moonlight and the stars twinkled above, sat on a small patch of undisturbed grass and allowed himself a single moment of mourning. The cabin had been torn down, but his determination, his family's legacy, and his connection to the land were far from gone. The real fight was about to begin, and knew he was no longer alone. The following morning woke to a quiet that felt heavier than usual. The lake was calm, reflecting the soft glow of dawn, but the destruction of his cabin lingered like a shadow over the landscape. He brewed coffee, sat on a stump near the water, and tried to organize his thoughts. The letters, phone calls, and half-demolished remains of the cabin had left him emotionally exhausted. Yet, amid the despair, one thing was clear: he could not let this stand. He had reached out to several local attorneys the previous evening, sending pictures, statements, and detailed notes about the events. Now he waited for advice on what could be done to stop the HOA's overreach, and seek justice for the destruction of his family property. The first attorney he contacted returned his call mid-morning. "Mr. Parker, from what you've described, this appears to be highly irregular," the lawyer said. "A homeowners association cannot demolish property without proper court approval. You have documented proof of payment, and you've taken photographs of the demolition in progress. That will be important. The next step is to file an injunction to halt any further destruction, and we may pursue restitution once the HOA is held accountable." Listened carefully, feeling a cautious sense of hope. "So it's illegal?" he asked. "Yes," the lawyer replied. "Even if they claim you owe fees, they cannot take matters into their own hands. You need to move quickly." After hanging up, returned to the cabin site, surveying the wreckage. Splintered wood, torn insulation, and shattered glass littered the yard. Memories of his grandfather's handiwork swirled in his mind, each beam a symbol of care and pride. Despite the devastation, he refused to let anger dictate his actions. Patience and evidence would be his strongest tools. Spent the day cataloging every remaining piece of the cabin. He photographed doors, windows, furniture, and even small items that had survived. He noted the construction equipment and workers he had seen the day before. Every detail mattered, and every note added strength to the case he was building. As evening approached, he made a call that had been on his mind since the demolition. His cousin, Rachel, a senior attorney with the Department of Justice, answered promptly. "Rachel, it's worse than I thought," said, his voice tight. "They've started tearing down the cabin. There's barely anything left. I don't know where to begin." Rachel's tone was firm but reassuring. "Don't confront them directly. That could make things worse. Document everything, just like you've been doing. I'll look into the HOA's records and see what legal avenues we can pursue immediately. This isn't just about unpaid fees. If they demolished property without proper authorization, there are federal guidelines that protect you. I'll make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug." Her confidence bolstered. For the first time since the demolition began, he felt that he had a path forward. He gathered all the materials he had compiled over the week and organized them into a single folder. Each document, photo, and statement now represented both a shield and a sword against the HOA's unlawful actions. Late that night, couldn't sleep. He sat near the edge of the lake, staring at the dark water. He reflected on the way the HOA had acted with such ease, assuming that no resident would fight back. The thought angered him, but it also strengthened his resolve. His grandfather's cabin had been more than wood and nails. It was a symbol of integrity, hard work, and family pride. If the HOA thought they could erase it without consequence, they had severely underestimated him. Over the next few days, routine changed. He visited the cabin site daily, keeping meticulous records of any further activity. He contacted neighbors discreetly, not to alarm them, but to see if anyone else had faced similar treatment. Stories emerged, quiet tales of fines, liens, and threats. Some neighbors expressed fear of the HOA, while others were inspired by his determination to fight back. Throughout it all, Rachel coordinated quietly in the background. She reviewed HOA financial records, communications, and prior complaints. Every discrepancy she found painted a clearer picture. The HOA's actions were not simply bureaucratic mistakes. There were patterns of overreach and intimidation that left's case undeniably strong. By the end of the week, had shifted from shock and frustration to focused determination. He knew the fight would be difficult, and he also knew it would take patience and strategy. But with his evidence organized and the support of his DOJ-trained cousin, he felt prepared for the battle ahead. The cabin may have been partially destroyed, but the fight for justice was just beginning and was ready to see it through to the end. The lake reflected the silver light of the moon that night, calm and serene. Allowed himself a small smile, thinking that no matter what the HOA did, they could never erase the legacy, resilience, and determination that lived within him. By the following week, his life had transformed from quiet weekends by the lake to a focused mission for justice. He spent his mornings gathering documentation, his afternoons reviewing correspondence, and his evenings consulting with his cousin, Rachel. She was methodical, precise, and uncompromising, a perfect ally in the fight ahead. Rachel arrived at the lake one bright morning, her presence commanding yet calm. She had seen countless disputes in her career, but the blatant disregard for property rights in this case had caught her attention. "This is serious," she said as they walked along the lakeshore away from prying eyes. "They can't just demolish a property without legal authorization. We're going to hold them accountable." Nodded, grateful for her support. "I've kept everything organized, photos, letters, emails, and even a record of the workers I saw demolishing the cabin." "Good," Rachel replied. "Documentation is everything. It establishes a timeline and proves intent. The HOA underestimated you. They thought you'd give in or stay quiet. That won't happen." They sat on the dock, watching the water ripple in the morning sunlight. Rachel explained the next steps. "I'll coordinate with a small team from the Department of Justice. We'll request records from the HOA, check their financials, and investigate the board members' actions. Anything illegal or abusive will be flagged. We can stop them from taking further actions and pursue restitution for the damage already done." Listened carefully, feeling a mixture of relief and anticipation. The cabin may have been partially destroyed, but now the scales of power were beginning to shift. Over the next few days, the DOJ team quietly began its work. They requested detailed financial statements from the HOA, including all past assessments, liens, and disbursements. The board, confident in its small-town influence, initially ignored the requests, but Rachel anticipated this. She filed formal notices and subpoenas, making it clear that compliance was not optional. Meanwhile, continued to visit the cabin site, documenting every detail and speaking discreetly with neighbors. Rumors began to circulate about federal involvement. Some neighbors, who had previously been afraid to speak up, now whispered about the board's possible mismanagement. One afternoon, a local resident approached with a nervous look. "I didn't want to get involved before," she said quietly, "but I've seen and the board manipulating records. They've been using unpaid fees as a cover for other things. You're not imagining it." His heart raced. He thanked the neighbor and assured her confidentiality. The revelation confirmed what Rachel suspected. The HOA's actions were not just bureaucratic mistakes, but deliberate and possibly fraudulent. Back at his temporary workspace in the cabin's backyard, and Rachel reviewed the evidence. "Look at this," Rachel said, pointing to a series of spreadsheets she had obtained. "There are payments recorded for your property, but the HOA never credited them. Some entries are missing entirely and others were altered. This isn't just negligence, it's manipulation." Clenched his fists. "So all those notices were lies?" "Exactly," Rachel replied. "They intended to intimidate you into paying for something you never owed, and the demolition, that was an escalation to silence you." With the team's findings, Rachel began drafting a formal complaint against the HOA and its board members. She outlined the illegal demolition, the records, and the harassment of residents. The plan was clear: hold the HOA accountable, secure restitution for, and prevent further abuses. Despite the legal strategy, could not ignore the emotional toll of the cabin's destruction. He took long walks along the lakeshore, reflecting on the memories tied to the land. Yet each evening, he returned to his makeshift office with renewed resolve. The support from his family, the DOJ, and even sympathetic neighbors gave him strength he had never known. By the end of the week, the HOA board began to feel pressure. Emails and letters from the federal team prompted hushed meetings and tense phone calls. The once confident board members, particularly, were now navigating uncertainty for the first time. They realized their small-town influence might not be enough to protect them. Sitting by the lake at sunset, allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. The fight for justice had moved beyond frustration and helplessness. With Rachel and the DOJ team on his side, he had the resources, knowledge, and support to confront the HOA's overreach. For the first time since the demolition, felt a sense of momentum. The cabin's physical structure had been harmed, but the spirit of his family's legacy and his determination to protect it remained unbroken. The lake reflected the fiery colors of the sunset, a reminder that even in the aftermath of destruction, resilience and justice could shine brightly. The battle lines were drawn, and knew the confrontation with the HOA would soon reach its peak. But with strategy, evidence, and family support, He was prepared to face whatever came next. The following week brought a tense energy to the lake community. His cabin site remained quiet during the day, but the air was thick with anticipation. Rumors of federal involvement had begun to circulate discreetly among neighbors. Some whispered of audits and subpoenas, while others spoke in cautious tones about what might happen next. The once confident HOA board, particularly, had begun acting nervously. Arrived early one morning, determined to document any activity. As he walked along the remaining edges of the property, he noticed the board president's car parked unusually near the office. He ducked behind a tree and observed the building from a distance. And two other board members were in heated conversation, papers scattered across a table. Their voices carried, though clipped. "They can't do this to us," one of the members said. "The DOJ won't let it slide so quickly." His tone was sharper than it ever heard. "We didn't think anyone would fight back. We need a plan to cover everything up and fast." His heart raced. The realization hit him. The board's actions were intentional, not mistakes. They had been manipulating records, falsifying fees, and targeting residents deliberately. The demolition of his cabin had been a calculated move to intimidate him before he discovered the full extent of their scheme. Later that day, a confidential source reached out too. The HOA treasurer, a quiet man who had rarely spoken publicly, contacted him by phone, careful not to leave a trace. "I've been watching what's happening," the treasurer whispered. "Has been embezzling funds. The unpaid fees notices, the fines, the demolition. It was all to distract from her activities. I didn't want to get involved before, but the DOJ is looking now, and it's time the truth comes out." Thanked him, promising discretion. The insider's revelation confirmed what Rachel had suspected. The HOA's overreach wasn't simply overzealous management, it was deliberate, deceptive, and self-serving. This added a new dimension to the legal case. The board's actions weren't just unlawful, they were fraudulent. With this information, Rachel and her team accelerated their investigation. They began cross-referencing the HOA's financial statements with records and the accounts of other residents. Patterns emerged quickly. Payments that had been properly made by residents were recorded as missing, fines were added retroactively without explanation, and some funds had disappeared entirely. The evidence was undeniable. Spent long hours with Rachel and the DOJ team, reviewing documents, comparing records, and preparing formal statements. The treasurer's confidential information provided additional clarity, revealing how and the board had used intimidation tactics to suppress dissent. Every day, the picture of corruption became more vivid. Meanwhile, the HOA board began to show signs of cracking under the pressure. Rumors of federal audits and subpoenas spread through the community, making residents more cautious. Some neighbors who had previously stayed silent now spoke discreetly too, sharing their own experiences of fines, threats, and other manipulations. They provided corroborating evidence that strengthened the case against the board. Even the workers involved in the demolition started asking questions, realizing that the project had been carried out without proper legal authorization. Some of them approached quietly, expressing concern about the legality of the orders they had followed. Every small disclosure added weight to the growing investigation. By the end of the week, it was clear that the HOA's confidence was faltering. Avoided public appearances, phone calls went unanswered, and meetings were abruptly canceled. The board members, once unified in their intimidation tactics, began questioning each other, unsure who might face the brunt of the investigation. Sitting on the remaining dock at his cabin site, felt a mixture of relief and determination. The destruction of the cabin had been a shock, but the truth had a way of revealing itself. With Rachel and the DOJ guiding the investigation, the HOA's tactics were unraveling. What had once seemed like a hopeless battle was now transforming into a fight with momentum firmly on his side. That night, as the moon reflected across the still waters of the lake, allowed himself a small smile. The cabin might have been reduced to splinters, but justice was beginning to take shape. The HOA's armor had cracks, and those cracks were widening. The long-awaited reckoning was coming, and this time would not just witness it. He would be part of it. The following morning, the lake community woke to a quiet that was different from usual. There were no letters, no calls, and no distant hum of construction equipment. Instead, A sense of anticipation hung in the air. Arrived at the cabin site early, noting that the remaining debris from the demolition had been cordoned off with caution tape. At first, he thought it might be another HOA maneuver, but the mood was different this time, official. Rachel arrived with the DOJ team shortly after, her calm authority immediately setting the tone. She briefed on the progress. "We've secured temporary control over the HOA's records," she said. "We've frozen their accounts to prevent any further misuse, and subpoenas have been issued to ensure cooperation. The board will answer for the demolition and any financial irregularities." Exhaled, feeling both relief and a surge of anticipation. The battle that had begun with a simple letter about unpaid fees had escalated into a full investigation, and for the first time, the corrupt board might actually face consequences. News crews had begun gathering at the edge of the community, though and Rachel kept their distance. Residents started showing up quietly, curiosity mixed with cautious hope. Some had suffered under the HOA's intimidation tactics and had longed for accountability. The federal presence signaled that change was finally coming. Inside the HOA office, the atmosphere was tense. Paced back and forth, her usual composure replaced with visible anxiety. Board members whispered to each other, their confidence shaken by the arrival of federal investigators and the freezing of accounts. They realized that their actions had consequences far beyond the small town they had tried to control. Investigators worked systematically, going through files, cross-referencing financial records, and interviewing staff and residents. And Rachel observed quietly, noting every step. It was painstaking work, but the evidence was clear. Fees, manipulated records, and unauthorized demolition had been carried out under the board's direction. The breaking point came when the HOA treasurer, who had previously provided confidential information to, cooperated fully with investigators. He to the embezzlement, detailing how had used unpaid fees as a cover for personal gain. The documents he provided revealed a pattern of deception and intimidation spanning several years. By mid-afternoon, and her co-conspirators were formally confronted with the evidence. Watched from a distance as investigators explained the charges: fraud, property destruction without authorization, and manipulation of resident accounts. Its usual air of superiority was gone, replaced by a nervous shuffle and whispered defenses. Outside, residents began to gather quietly, watching the proceedings unfold. The once intimidating HOA now seemed small and powerless in the face of the law. For years, fear had kept neighbors silent, but now they whispered to each other, relief and vindication replacing anxiety. Felt a mix of emotions. The cabin had been partially destroyed, yet this moment of accountability brought a sense of justice he hadn't dared to hope for. Rachel approached him quietly, her expression both serious and satisfied. "The damage can be addressed through restitution," she said, "and the board will be held responsible. This isn't just about your cabin, it's about ensuring the HOA can't intimidate residents ever again." Nodded, feeling the weight of months of stress begin to lift. The cabin might have been lost physically, but its legacy and the principle it represented had not been defeated. He realized that the courage to stand up, combined with careful documentation and legal strategy, had turned the tide. By evening, the federal team had completed their initial work, and the board was formally removed from power pending further legal proceedings. The neighborhood, once quiet and fearful, began to buzz with cautious optimism. Residents spoke quietly about reclaiming their sense of security, about finally having a voice against arbitrary authority. Walked to the lake, the water reflecting the warm glow of the sunset. For weeks, it had been a place of reflection and frustration, a mirror to his anger and helplessness. Tonight, it symbolized victory and resilience. He sat on the remaining dock, remembering his grandfather's hands guiding him through the early days at the cabin. Though the physical structure had been destroyed, the spirit of the place and the values it represented remained intact. Rachel joined him, her eyes scanning the horizon. "You stood your ground," she said softly. "You documented everything and refused to be intimidated. That's why this worked. The truth always has a way of coming out." Smiled faintly, feeling the satisfaction of a battle fought wisely and courageously. The fight wasn't over completely, but the first victory had been claimed. The cabin's destruction would not be the final word, justice was. The lake shimmered in the moonlight, calm yet alive. For it was more than a reflection of the sky. It was a symbol of resilience, family legacy, and the unyielding pursuit of what is right. The weeks following the federal intervention felt surreal too. The once powerful HOA board had been removed, their offices frozen, and investigations were. Residents who had lived in fear now walked through the community with a renewed sense of confidence. Signs of change were everywhere, roads were maintained, common areas were being restored, and for the first time in years, the lake neighborhood felt like a place of peace again. Spent mornings at the cabin site, surveying the remains of his grandfather's property. Though much of the structure had been destroyed, he saw potential rather than loss. Each splintered beam and charred plank reminded him not of what was gone, but of what could be rebuilt. With Rachel's guidance, he began drafting plans to reconstruct the cabin, stronger and safer, while maintaining the charm and history that made it special. Neighbors approached him cautiously at first, offering words of encouragement and shared stories of the HOA's overreach. Gradually, they became more open, sharing documents and photographs of past incidents. Realized that his fight had not only preserved his own legacy, but had empowered others to stand up as well. For many, he had become a symbol of resilience and courage. Rachel continued to oversee the legal process, ensuring that restitution for the demolition was pursued properly. The federal team worked efficiently to hold the former board members accountable, freezing any personal assets linked to misappropriated HOA funds. Faith in the justice system, once shaken by disbelief and frustration, was restored. One crisp morning, as walked along the lakeshore, he noticed construction crews arriving with lumber, tools, and materials for the rebuilding project. The new cabin would rise slowly, each plank laid with care, echoing the craftsmanship of his grandfather. He imagined afternoons spent fishing by the dock, evenings reading by the fireplace, and family gatherings filled with laughter. The thought brought a rare, peaceful smile to his face. Rachel joined him on the dock, looking out over the calm waters. "You've done something important here," she said. "This cabin represents more than family memories. It represents standing up for what's right. And now, others in the community can see that justice isn't just a word, it's a reality." Nodded, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. The fight had been long, exhausting, and at times disheartening, but the outcome had reaffirmed his belief in perseverance, honesty, and courage. He thought of his grandfather and the hands that had built the original cabin. That legacy had survived, not just in wood and nails, but in spirit, determination, and resilience. Over the next few weeks, the cabin slowly took shape. The new structure mirrored the old one, with modern enhancements for safety and durability. Friends and neighbors, inspired by his journey, occasionally volunteered to help with tasks like painting, landscaping, and installing the dock. There was laughter and conversation once again along the lake, the community feeling more connected than ever before. The HOA, under court-appointed management, began operating with transparency and fairness. Policies were revised, records were audited, and residents' rights were respected. And the former board faced legal proceedings, ensuring that similar abuses could not happen in the future. Residents now felt safe speaking up, knowing that accountability was possible. One evening, stood on the dock, watching the sun dip behind the trees. The lake reflected a fiery blend of oranges and pinks, and the gentle breeze carried the familiar scent of pine. He felt a profound sense of closure. The destruction of the cabin, once a source of grief and anger, had transformed into an opportunity for renewal and growth. As he looked across the water, realized that his grandfather's legacy was intact. It had survived demolition, intimidation, and the fear that had once pervaded the community. The cabin, though newly rebuilt, would continue to hold the memories of the past while standing as a testament to courage, justice, and perseverance. With a deep breath, smiled. The fight had been worth it. The lake was quiet now, but it no longer held fear, it held promise. And in that quiet, peaceful moment, he knew that new beginnings were always possible, even after the most challenging storms. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next mystery on HOA Hunter Stories.